Well, let's go ahead and get started today, and we are going to have I hope, a lively discussion on Job, the book of Job. My prayer for this session has been that the book of Job, you'll never read it the same way again after today. It's one of those books that people don't quite know what to do with, but hopefully you'll see it's a charged book and very practical for, I think, with what a lot of people in our congregations and in our pews are going through, and even for those of us who have opportunities to help people who are going through tough times in their life, through grieving, especially, and those kinds of things. I think the light bulbs will come on today for us. So on that and all the high hopes that I have, let's pray and we'll get started. Lord, thank you so much for your grace and your love to us, your patience. Lord, as we see in the book of Job, Lord, and as we navigate through, we pray that you would alert our heart and our minds to your truth. Guide us through your Spirit. I pray for these students who are in present ministries and are preparing for future ministries, that you would speak to them as well, and that this book would become a foundation, a part of their arsenal of tools that will equip them and help them to reach out and help people who are hurting and are feeling the pains of a world that's fallen and are experiencing suffering from all of the various sources. Lord, we know that this is where a lot of people are at in this world, and Lord, it's our job to reach out and help through ministry in various ways. So Lord, we thank you. Even in our own lives, I pray that this book would be a blessing. Many of us too have gone through or are going through tough times and are experiencing suffering in various ways. And I even pray that this discussion, this humble discussion, would touch hearts and help us to heal and mend and even go through the grieving process ourselves, where we've experienced loss. So we love you and we thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we're getting down to the home stretch. I'm looking at the course calendar here, the schedule. We're in week 10. And today we'll just be covering the book of Job. Next week we'll get into Ezra and Nehemiah, maybe carry over a little bit into week 12, pick up Esther, and then finish the semester with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And depending on how much time we have left, I put a little discussion in there on archaeology, but we might have some time to talk about that a little bit. But I purposely put that at the end because I wanted to make sure we had ample time to cover the text in these books. So, and then that pesky final exam at the end. Just as a way of reminder, just please stay on top of the group discussions every week. That's an easy way of getting the full credit, 10 points. And I want you to stay on top of that because staying close to when we have our discussion, you all leaving here and going home and having some time to reflect and share amongst yourselves. I really want that to be a positive experience for you all. So this week's discussion on Job, the group discussion, will be about how the book of Job applies to our counseling ministries as pastors or youth pastors or Sunday school teachers and all of that. So I think it'll be a real practical discussion. So make sure you take full advantage of that. The weekly reading quizzes, Job will be posted today. It's not there, so don't freak out. It'll be there by high noon today. And let's see, I don't have to talk too much about that. If you've fallen behind a little bit in those, you can catch up. As you know, I'm not going to penalize you for catching up with the reading quizzes. Some of you have some catch-up work to do on those. And then there's 5 extra credit possibilities. Some of you have been emailing me about the conferences that you're wanting to attend. I know the regional ETS is coming to campus. Hint, hint, hint. Right? That would be a great opportunity if you could break away and go over there and attend an afternoon session on Old Testament. That would be a way to get into that extra credit option there. So not everybody can take advantage of that, but conferences like that is what I'm looking for. If you got an idea of something similar to that, just give me an email and I'll approve that for you, and you can count that in your extra credit bucket. So that's a pretty good chunk of extra credit, opportunities. So I'm always surprised how sometimes students don't take full advantage of that. But I do it because, not just for extra credit, that helps the tension, sometimes the anxiety of missing points on quizzes because of those very difficultly worded questions that I throw at you week to week. Sorry about that. But it's just learning styles. A lot of you are, like for me, I didn't like those standardized tests. I never did well on them. So here I am writing them for you. But I prefer the essays. Yeah, you got that? I prefer the essays myself, but this class is pretty large, so I can't do that functionally. Otherwise, Patrick would fire, he'd fire himself. But fire yourself, yeah. But anyway, what was I saying with that? Learning styles. So those are like writing-based assignments. So I liked those as a student, opportunities to write and communicate and get my ideas down. So I do that because some of you are more that way, and the extra benefit is extra credit. So all that to say, let's keep pressing forward to the end and cross the finish line. Everybody will do great. And now that we're past the midterm and all of that. All right. Well, let's open up the book of Job. We need to transition from Song of Solomon. We barely got through that last week. And not with any details, but was last week's discussion on Song of Solomon helpful? Was it kind of a shock or throw you for a loop? What's interesting in the online class is that there's a lot of, there's a few stay-at-home moms, and anyway, where am I going with this? I hope that it was a helpful discussion for all of us married folks out there, that kind of a thing. All right. Well, the book of Job is the last book in our collection of wisdom books. Here we go. And the more I've been thinking about Job in terms of its position in the canon with the other books that we've seen, like Song of Solomon, like Ecclesiastes, like the book of Proverbs, you've got this collection of wisdom, like Song of Solomon or like Ecclesiastes. It's focusing in this case on a particular individual, largely, and a group of 4 friends, as we'll see. But the book is in this genre of wisdom because the book itself deals with, I think, one of the most widespread experiential questions that's being asked by anybody through that window. You hear this question a lot. That's the basic form of the question. But the book of Job is going to dive into this kind of question, but in a radical kind of ancient kind of way. The book of Job is a radical departure from the ancient way of answering this question. It's hard to know. It's a difficult book to time and place in terms of where it fits best in history, authorship, and audience. I think the basic approach that I take is the right one. No, just approach this book as a practical book and almost a timeless book. It's speaking to a lot of different audiences from its inception all the way through the history of Israel. So I'm going to make a case a little bit later on that suggests that I think the heart behind this book, you always ask yourself, what does this book, how did it come about? And the original author, what's his driving motive? Well, almost like what we've said about Solomon, maybe writing near the end of his life, looking back on a life of mistakes and regret, and coming up with his magnum opus, Ecclesiastes. The author, we don't know his name, is putting this book together to address this question for the faithful in Israel. And it's a book that's addressing this question. The big question of Job is going to be this, kind of like this. This is a thesis statement. Why do the righteous suffer? The problem with this question, you all know, if you're challenged by somebody walking to you up on the street, is, well, are there good people? Who are these good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, there are no good people. We talk about sin. We talk about, so there's something broader to be said about. But if you focus that question on why the righteous suffer, that's really the heartbeat behind the book of Job, instead of this question. But this is the focus of the book of Job, and you see this kind of question showing up throughout the biblical text, even outside of the context of the book of Job. So this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to do a little exercise here in a little bit, and part of our discussion will be actually breaking out of the book of Job and looking at Israel's history and recognizing some pretty significant connection points on this question. And I think you'll be surprised, at least I was, so how this book can connect with other inspired books. But let's just take a moment and turn to your discussion partner, groups of 2 or 3, and just think about this question: why do the righteous suffer? And talk about how that question would apply practically to your present or future ministries. How is this question popping up? How is it showing its head in your present and future ministries? Go ahead. Talk. All right. Huh? Oh, you need more time? I mean, that is kind of a loaded question, isn't it?
We have like 40 more minutes.
40 more minutes to discuss it? Yeah. That could be the basic, the rest of our time together is getting the insight out of that question, right? But yeah, it does strike a chord, doesn't it? What were some of the, go ahead and share some insights that you came up with? Anyone? Can I call on some people? Now let's see. I'll pick on Laura's group back here. What'd y'all come up with?
Well, we said because of the fall, then we're living in this fallen world.
Yes.
And so we have to experience the consequences for our own sins and the consequences for other people's sins. But for those of us who are believers, then we get to experience the redemption of seeing how God uses even our suffering to be a testimony to other people.
You've just given the whole lecture. Man. What do I need to talk about now? No, you hit on a few things there. You guys are smart. You've been around this a while. Let's see. How about, who'd like to share? How about Jonathan? What you guys share over here?
Well, one of the things, which Jonathan?
You.
Okay, I'll take it. One of the things we talked about was, and we're all in the same world, why should we be any different? And why should we be exempt from suffering when the rest of the world around us is suffering? When, how else would we stay near to God and also be able to empathize with the rest of the world?
Really good. Yeah, it gets into, the question of Job particularly focuses on his suffering as one who's identified as righteous, but that certainly, as we'll see, doesn't exclude him from the suffering that comes from the hand of a fallen world, right? So that's everybody in the boat, so to speak.
Kind of wrapped it all up.
Yeah. So, and the question, what are, how about, let's see. How about Corey? What did your group talk about over here?
Yeah, we something is really kind of revealing as to what our faith is actually in. If it's in our things, and we're suffering because we lose family, job, whatever it might be. It sheds some light on, okay, is my faith really in God, or is it in these things that God has provided now He's taken away, and what does that do to my faith?
Have you ever ran across someone in your church community who's asked this very question? Yeah, that's the real question. And it's interesting because we're getting, in the book of Job, we're going to see, and we'll explore this a little bit, but you raised it, is God's involvement. And how is God involved in my suffering? That's really a huge question, is it not? People want to know that, and we'll see. We'll explore that a little bit in this book as we talk about it. This picture is interesting because it kind of hints at that and how the book of Job moves ahead with the addressing a little bit of that question, although I think at the end of the day we'll still kind of have a little bit of a, wow, there's just a lot of mystery behind it, but we do have some things come out of the fog, so to speak, in the book of Job with regards to why the righteous suffer. It's true, the book's not going to make any claim that, well, the righteous are exempt from suffering. It's not in the book, Or is it going to help us adequately understand why is it that the unrighteous suffer less than the righteous at times? The equity aspect of suffering. Well, probably not. It's not going to necessarily give us that. But it's interesting with regards to the divine involvement behind suffering. We've got geniuses out there making claims and almost criticizing. Really, the criticism comes pretty strongly from guys like him, right? With regards to suffering, the radical atheist position. They're going to come in, and if you've ever had this happen in a friendly discussion with someone who holds these views, agnostic or atheist, their very criticism is in the face of suffering, right? The whole, how can a good God, how can an all-powerful God allow, fill in the blank. So Richard Dawkins, Let's get up off our knees, stop cringing before boogeymen and virtual fathers. Face reality and help science do something constructive about human suffering. That's the answer from the scientific atheistic branch. Now, it's not to say that a Christian could dive into a medical field and see his medical expertise as a ministry to alleviate suffering. Obviously, in the history of the establishment of hospitals and orphanages and all of these things, the church has had a huge play in all of this. So, guys like him, they don't have the corner on the market with regards to how science can benefit and help alleviate human suffering. He also says the total amount of suffering per year, and this is the critical part that we hear, in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, as if animal suffering and human suffering are on the same plane. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured only by rasping parasites. Thousands of species are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Don't you get tired of him sometimes? So there's, this is the in-your-face critical voices that we hear. And these guys popularize this. And in your Barnes & Noble bookstores, you go over and they've got most of the shelf space, with these kinds of books. So there are people in our churches who hear this, and we have to be aware of, no, well, wait a minute. There's another approach to this. Actually, what I'm going to do with the book of Job, I think that the book of Job actually presents a very honest and truthful response to the question of suffering. And I'm going to bracket out animal suffering. We're talking about human suffering. This is what the book of Job is focusing on. So the animal suffering question we'll have to bracket that out for another time. But their answer, the idea that the purpose to suffering, well, there is no purpose. It's just the byproduct of natural selection and survival of the fittest. So that's their answer to suffering. Well, we can maybe come up with a few cures along the way, but other than that. And so this question of human suffering is really the one that comes in, and when you start bringing in worldviews like atheism, like agnosticism, and other major worldviews, it really levels the playing field. It gets you really honest really quick. So I just wanted to do this a little bit before we get started. We'll come back to this slide, but what I've tried to do, by the way, this discussion comes out of a very readable book. I just brought it with me. This is a Worldviews book, but it's short and readable, and it's a nice book that you can hand out to your buddies. But it talks about, and these are his terms that come out of, I think it's Kokel, Gregory Kokel. He's come up with the worldview of Godism. Of course, that's theism. That's our worldview. And how each of these worldviews answers the question of ultimate reality, what's ultimately true, and how that connects to the answer to the question of suffering, the problem of evil and suffering. So according to our worldview, God's created reality for his divine purpose and rules over it. So sovereign, his all-powerfulness, and all of those things fall into play. That's the foundation upon which we'll build our response to that question. Of course, the middle one is Richard Dawkins, and the whole naturalism. Matter is the ultimate reality. Molecules and atoms, that's what we're made of. We don't really have any control over that. We're just along for the ride. Matter is reality. I guess I need to go over to this. Well, we'll start with the middle column, then we'll come to the third column. So mindism, this is a little broader, but brings in some of those Eastern religions, where it's either God, little g, God is all, God is everything, so there's no distinction between that which is created and the existence of this idea of God is all, or you are God. So Amy, I don't know if you know it or not, but you're the center of your universe.
You're funny.
And if you stand up on the chair, you could say, I am God. And what that ultimately means, though, it's on you, what happens to you and how you deal with it. And if it's true that you come back in your next life, you may be coming up higher or lower, depending on how well you do in dealing with bad things that happen to you. You see? So it's really your responsibility to come up with your own solution to the problem of evil, if you hold to this view, the mindism idea. So I kind of got a little crazy there. You are ultimately responsible and to blame for all the bad that comes your way. That's how they're going to respond to it. The middle one is the Richard Dawkins. No rhyme or reason, no justice, no purpose other than to advance the gene pool. Purpose then can be invented. You see a lot of creativity, right? Or if you are morally driven, you can be a doctor and find a cure to all evil. That would be a purpose for life and all of that. Or out of reality, this is us, which is fallen. We've mentioned this. Good can come, which y'all have said, and ultimately will come. So I threw in a few extra words there to kind of talk about the present, but then the glorious future that we'll see as well with regards to the reality. If God is the ultimate reality in his creation and he rules over it, then there's more to be said. All right. Let's see if I covered everything on this. So you can use this as an apologetical conversation starter if you're talking to somebody who is coming at you strongly, wanting to argue with some of this stuff. A strategy to use to level the playing field is to approach it as from a worldview perspective. And you can ask the question, well, what's your ultimate reality? How would you explain ultimate reality? And maybe from that kind of levels the playing field a little bit. And then from that, you can kind of advance the conversation, say, well, let's not talk about the Bible quite yet, but how do you, in your worldview, explain the problem of evil and human suffering? That's a legitimate worldview question that ultimately has to be answered and addressed, especially with this middle one. Maybe you'll run into some people from this perspective. I was talking to Emmanuel. He's not here today. He's from India, and some of his challenges in going home and addressing some of the critical voices that come from the Hindu perspective, for example. So that's kind of that mindism at the bottom. But we had a long conversation about this. But dealing with the scientist, the educated Richard Dawkins type, you probably never win an argument. But it's really interesting to help them realize and recognize, honestly, well, how do I deal with, the problem of evil and suffering with my worldview? And, you've got a worldview. It has to be logically consistent in order to be valid, a worldview. So it's going to address more than just the question of evil and suffering, ultimate reality, suffering, who is man, that's another, or humanity, how do we fit into the ultimate reality? These are worldview questions that you can deal with. So either you've got these three choices with regards to that third column. God is real and is somehow and in some way linked to the reality of suffering in the world. That's option one. Option two is there is no God and there's no God at all linked to the reality of suffering in this world. Or number three, you are the God who's ultimately linked to the reality of your suffering in the world. And it's your solution to come up with on your own. So the book of Job is going to address and help us to understand this first row. It's going to come at this question from the recognition and admission that there is a God who is ruling and sovereign and in control in the midst of the experience of human suffering. All right? So that's all this discussion before we get to the text. But I'm trying to build a case that this is a book that has some far-reaching practical implications for our ministries. So, and the book of Job is going to challenge the notion that suffering is devoid of any moral value or meaning. All right? It's going to help us see, kind of a glimpse in, and see the fact that there is something going on the cosmic divine plane with regards to suffering that's valuable. It's mysterious, but it's valuable. And we'll see glimpses of that as we look into the book of Job. The ancient way, one of the things that it does in its historic context. So in the ancient world, this is where we get, how far back, where exactly. Just broadly, the common thinking in the ancient mind was that the gods, little g gods, reward the righteous and punish the wicked. That was the way everybody thought in the ancient world. And as we'll see, the book of Job is going to challenge this notion head on and call it pig-headed and wrong. It's not that way when we talk about why the righteous suffer. There are different categories, and there's a deeper sense of understanding. It's not as simple as, hey, you're suffering because you've done some bad things. But how often, think about it, how often is that way of thinking true in our present time? How many people out the window are going through a hard time or watching somebody else go through a hard time and are thinking in their mind, well, God's just punishing them in some way, or maybe, I just deserve this, that kind of mentality or something like that. We still have that way of thinking. The wicked are punished and the righteous are rewarded, and that's the divine economy. That's how God works. Well, we're going to find out the book of Job says, no, it's not necessarily that way at all. And just like the book of Ecclesiastes that we saw addressed the question of what is the moral value of life, here's where I see the connection in terms of the book of Job being a wisdom book. It's going to present the moral value of suffering. It's going to get into what is the moral value of suffering. This is what Richard Dawkins is going to absolutely reject, and will personally choose never to accept unless God gets a hold of him. But the question of how could there ever be something good come out of that? Out of this scenario, is there, and he would say, that means there's no God because there's nothing good coming out of that. So this is where people are at with this question. The overall structure of the book, we'll see it like this. There's a prologue and an epilogue. Those are kind of 1 to 2 chapters each on the front end, on the back end. The prologue is going to set up the whole idea of the testing of Job. So we come back to our good friend, the idea of testing. So there's some key terms that we'll want to keep track of as we go through. We get into a long, long discussion, almost painfully long discussion that Job has with his friends. After we leave the prologue, we move into a long discourse, conversation, and Job is having a conversation with these friends. There's 4 of them, 3, then another one comes along. That's really Elihu. Elihu, his speeches come on. That's the 4th friend. And then finally we hear from the Lord near the end of the book. So chapter 38 through chapter 42, Yahweh, the Lord, is going to step in, and Job and the Lord will have a conversation. And then finally we have a short epilogue where we see the vindication of Job, or you might say the restoration of Job, how the Lord steps in his particular situation. So that's a broad, a lot of chapters, 42 chapters for this book. So we won't get into every jot and tittle of it, but we'll try our best to get the basic structure down. So let's take a look first at the prologue. And if we just look at how the details pan out, we kind of place Job outside of the historically known Israel. So Job is more like, you've probably heard this before, think of him more like a patriarch, like Abraham before Mount Sinai. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. He's a patriarch. He's in another land. He's outside of Israel, pre-Sinai. But he is like Abraham in terms of he is allowed to, and he's recognized in the text as one who is demonstrating righteousness and faithfulness before the Lord, Yahweh, capital Lord. So that's pretty significant. Let's take a look at an interesting reference just to kind of solidify this. Of all places, Ezekiel. Let's take a look at Ezekiel chapter 14. And there's an interesting reference to Job and the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 14, verse chapter 14. Here we go. Oh, do we have to read the whole thing? Maybe not. I was going to start at verse 12, but take a look down at verse 20. There's something going on here in the context, but then Ezekiel says, even though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in its midst as I live, declares the Lord God, they could not deliver either their son or their daughter. They would deliver only themselves by their righteousness. So there's an interesting reference there. Daniel here, in this reference, is not the Daniel of the exile, Daniel in the lion's den Daniel. It's not that Daniel, but rather probably an ancient Phoenician king who was named Daniel. And we see that in Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 3. But the point here is that the prophet Ezekiel is referring to Job in the context of patriarchs of the distant past. So I think we're on safe ground to think of Job in that way, as a patriarch of the distant past, with not all the details in our bucket. So the expectations then of Moses' instruction, or the Torah, are not so strict on Job. So we have to be sensitive to that as we read the book of Job. So unlike Abraham, we don't see Job evaluated through that lens of Moses' teaching or Torah instruction as much. So that's interesting. So let's take a look at how Job is introduced. We'll get to the text for a little bit here. Kind of like Fiddler on the Roof, maybe. Kind of like that, Job. Let's see here. John, up here, could you read for us verses 1 through 5?
There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one of his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually.
So we have a little bit of a glimpse into the life of Job. You see some of the details here are in place to help us understand the breadth of Job's possessions and great wealth. He was a wealthy individual like Abraham. His household was large in terms of sons and daughters. And you see a little bit of the details of Job's operation in terms of his expression of righteousness and doing it right before the Lord with regards to consecration or the sacrificing that Job's doing on behalf of his family. So verse 5. And then we have verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came along with them for the ride. So here we have an interesting parallel, I think, And it reminds me, I don't know if it reminds you, of Genesis 3:1, right? We've got activity, we've got Adam and Eve in the garden, and all of a sudden there's this uninvited guest, so to speak. So the devil shows up in a similar kind of way. And I think there's a conversation, the conversation that we have is, I guess there's parallels that will, because of this, we can draw parallels to what we know from Genesis chapter 3 and what happens next. I think we're invited now to understand now not only God's role, but we're going to have to recognize that Satan is going to have a role. The devil himself will have a role in terms of Job's experience. So that's going to be something we'll have to keep track of. But you see the conversation that Satan is going to have here, or you might say the adversary in the Hebrew. Verse 7, we have the conversation start. So the Lord, Yahweh, says to the adversary, or Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man." There's the idea of fearing God, one who fears God and turning away from evil or bad. Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" So in a similar kind of way, from Genesis 3, we have the devil challenging or trying to create, he's challenging the Lord with regards to something here. Verse 10, "Hast thou not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." So down through verse 12. But put forth thy hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. All right. So here's where we're going to get into, some interesting focus now. Satan's roaming around looking for new and creative ways to disrupt the Lord's agenda. So this is the satanic agenda, which we've seen before. Starting from Genesis 3, we understand he's about disrupting the divine agenda. He's been about, for some time, wandering about on earth, right, to destroy the image of God in humans. His preference would be by killing them or destroying their image of God-bearing capacity. So the devaluing of the image of God, the devaluing of the value of the human being, all of these things are part of the satanic agenda from the very beginning. So parallel that to this context. I think the devil here would have a preference to take Job out, but of course now we see the divine sovereignty and the control come in, where the Lord says, "No, don't touch him. Your hand can't be on him." So the satanic agenda also from the beginning has been to distract or confuse humanity from their experience of the fulfilled life on the earth. So there we have the ministry of Satan is to bring and introduce counterfeits in terms of humanity. Distractions. Don't seek the Lord for your joy, your happiness, but here's a few options for you. So this is part of the satanic agenda. Of course, it's interesting that comes out of his question. The devil thinks that that's the only reason that Job is, in such a happy state. Well, he's your best ally here, God, because you've been blessing him with all this stuff. If I just take it away, that's not going to be the case anymore. So there's this kind of challenge going on. So the very fact of the counterfeiting of all of the options for humanity to experience fulfillment in life outside of the one true thing, and that's the idea of the fear of the Lord, is what we've already seen in the book of Ecclesiastes. So Satan's question is revealing. Does Job fear God just because he's been blessed? I think you all said it earlier over here. That was one of your observations. So here's where we get into the practical side. Here's where the book of Job is going to help us minister to our people who are like this in Job's situation. Maybe they've been blessed. All their life they've gotten it good. Bad things really have never happened to me before. And all of a sudden I've got this cancer. Pastor, tell me, how do I think about this? How am I supposed to proceed? I thought all my life I've been doing it right, and I've been pleased and happy, but I don't feel so happy right now. All of a sudden my life and my health has been taken away. There's a lot of situations that I could bring in and fill in the blank right here. Up until now in my life, it's been this way, and all of a sudden the bomb has dropped, and now everything's changed. How many times have we run up, maybe in our own life, and sometimes helping people in their life work through these things. So this is where it happens in the book of Job. Or the idea that, the question that Satan asks is this idea of this protective hedge. You see that in the challenge. Well, you've been protecting your boy for all of his life. You've got this protective hedge around him, and isn't that the reason that Job is always blessing you? Because in his mind, he thinks that nothing bad will ever happen to him because the Lord's got his back. How's that? So there's a really real raw nerve here, I think, as we proceed with this book. Well, let's keep going here. Derek Rose, by the way, for you sports enthusiasts, is a well-known philosopher and is an expert in the field. No, I'm just kidding. He's the point guard for the New York Knicks. Here's his quote. I think good things come to good people. It's that same idea that we're talking about. This notion that the book of Job is going to fail. He articulates, interesting, being a basketball player in the NBA, speaking for a lot of people with his little, what do you call these little downloadable screensaver messages? But anyway, I found it from him. I thought it was interesting. It's an age-old idea. People think that way in our churches and in our pews. And I've already said it, but this is the ancient idea. And in the context of Job, we're going to see this, this idea, this ancient idea. The gods reward the righteous, and they punish the bad or the wicked. So this is where the prologue of the book of Job is going to dispel this notion. Does Job think this way? Is he thinking this way, like the ancients around him? That's part of how we're going to see this pan out. Yeah.
Do you think that I've often wondered why God let Satan do what he did, but do you think that God looks at eternity? We're only one little blip, and he knows that. God knows that. We don't know that, but he knows it, and he knows that what is...
How dare you ask the why question? Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
But,
that's a good question. That is an excellent question. Why would God allow?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to deal with that a little bit here as we move on. I hope I do adequately. So I don't want to...
Because I've had people ask me that.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to... I have some ideas about that question. I've been dealing and thinking about that question for some time now. As a human being on planet Earth, right? Don't we all think about that question? So that's a question not just for the other people who we're ministering to, but that's a question for us to get to the bottom of. Because if you like me have experienced loss and have had to go through grieving, serious grieving, if you've lost a parent, for example, or a loved one or a spouse or things like that. This is the question that this prologue is setting up for the whole book. Does Job only worship the Lord because he's being blessed? Right? I'm only going to go to church when I feel good about it. When I feel like the Lord is doing his part in my life or something like that. What about the times when he's not? or it feels that way anyway. Do I worship then? That's part of what we're going to see here in this first round. But let's take a look, and I've got some sad pictures to bring into the conversation. Pictures that express feelings, right? And what happens next comes as a bit of surprise. Satan, who, like what we see, he just kind of shows up from like Genesis 3. He's been allowed to, and that's key, allowed to roam around on earth for some time. But remember, the earth that he's roaming around on is this fallen world. From Genesis 3, remember we talked about in Romans 8, verse 20, God subjected creation to futility. Futility is the key word in the book of Ecclesiastes. Do you remember? So a world subjected to futility is the divine response to the fall. And so we live in a world where there's not this neutrality. So part of the fallenness of the world is that we have, apparently, Satan roaming around looking for people to bully around in some respect. We don't have, he's not walking through the door. He's limited. He's not God, but he's part of the fallen angelic rebellion that took place. We don't have all the details on that, but there's this sense that Satan and his band of brothers are out trying to wreak havoc. And here's a little micro glimpse into that reality. How does the Lord interact? What's the Lord's conversation? What's the Lord allowing to take place? And the why question, we'll get to that in a second. The purpose behind it all. All right. Let's see. Satan. So verse 13. Let's take a look at this. And this introduces us to a little bit of part of the why question, at least for me. Verse 13. Now it happened on the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, that a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans, they're from Sheva, this group of marauders attacked and took them, and they slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, this fire from God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So what I want to do here is kind of bracket out for a little bit here. And just one of the tent pegs that we want to put into the ground here is sovereign. Did I spell that right? Sovereign. No. E-I. No.
After our.
Man, I'm just.
R-E-I-G.
No?
Yes.
Okay. Sovereignty. There we go. That's a hard word to spell. All right. So this is a tent peg. God's sovereignty, God's control in the midst. And how I do this is this idea of the Lord, and we talk about the Lord's involvement. I think it's centered on this term here. So this idea of testing. Testing is biblically the activity when the Lord is involved, when there's suffering that's happening, when there's human suffering, whether it be, and here we think of our biblical examples. So the pinnacle of suffering, the pinnacle of testing for the patriarch Abraham. So Abraham, like Job, was Genesis 22. Remember that? So the testing of Abraham. He was tested with this extreme experience. It wasn't prolonged, but it was nonetheless a terrible, difficult experience for Abraham. And he came out as a result, and the byproduct of his testing was his declaration of one who fears God. All right. Now, another example that we talked about last fall was the implicit testing of Joseph. You remember Joseph when he was in Egypt, when he was abandoned and left to die, fratricide, by his brothers. He ends up in the bottom of an Egyptian prison. What do we have repeated time and time again with regards to his present situation? Who was with him? Who was with him? The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him in the midst of his suffering, his difficulty. So the idea of God's presence in the midst of the suffering. So this is kind of the picture that begins to emerge when we talk about testing. So the Lord is in the mix in sometimes mysterious way when there's testing involved. And this is where we get into the one who's righteous, or the suffering of the righteous or the faithful, like Job. Testing is the unique phenomena with regards to that particular kind of suffering. So the suffering of the righteous, we have to say, is unique in terms of the Lord's involvement, because it gets close to that idea of testing. So we'll talk more about this in a little bit. But in Job's situation, and I might want to draw over here now, we kind of have in this 13 through 19 section an interesting kind of breakout with regards to the causes of the suffering. So when you have testing, remember it's that metallurgical idea. So you've got gold being refined. You're going to have the fire. It's going to melt the gold, and the gold's going to become more pure. The impurities rise to the top, and the smelter will discard the impurities and refine the gold, so the quality of the gold improves. The fire, what causes the fire of suffering for Job's particular situation? Verse 15, you've got death due to human sin and conflict. This group of Sabaeans, there in verse 15. So human sin, other people's sin, is the cause. So I'll say causes. So here we're kind of what the book of Job here does is it helps us to understand and bracket out and kind of fill in a little bit of the color of what's the fallen world's role in bringing about the suffering experience of Job, for example. So you've got causes, human sin. I'll add the word conflict. Also, you've got other categories here. In verse 16, natural cause with regards to this fire, maybe a lightning bolt or something. So natural. So those two are and then you've got a repetition of number one with the Chaldean marauding band coming in, or the Babylonians, and then you've got another one with the wind, some kind of windstorm or something that many of us in the state experienced last night. Will again on Wednesday, this extreme storm that's coming. So we have to batten down the hatches and get ready. And this is really where I don't know for a lot of you if the natural causes, it's in the book of Job. It's not saying, oh, we've got to bracket that out. We can't talk about that. No, it's right here. So the fallenness of the world, if God has subjected the world to futility, part of my mind works and thinks about natural causes in terms of the fallenness of the world. So when you talk about storms, does the severity of the storm the result of the fallenness of the world? Could there have been a pre-fall storm? I play this game in my mind. That's not so bad and not so intense, not so harmful. Or were storms always to be that way? It's just our fault that we don't know how to respond to storms and get out of the way of lightning bolts and stuff, or tornadoes. Maybe we built our cities in the wrong place. I don't know. This is wet cement for me, But we have to be honest to say that is natural cause, so all of the kinds of things that happen. And we're going to get to another one here in a little bit in phase 2 of Job's situation with regards to disease and diseases that come. Human, so our health and all of that. There are effects of the fall that cause these kinds of experiences, and this is the source of suffering, but it also overlaps with regards to the testing idea. I was in college, probably my junior year, when I got the phone call from probably my mom, and she was the one that talked to me the most. This was before I was a Christian, so I had none of this foundation to process any of this. So my mom tells me that my brother and his friend Huey were kicking the soccer ball around in the front yard, and we grew up playing soccer in my home, and he was a great soccer player. When I was home, we'd kick around, have soccer matches and all that. We had this big front yard, big trees, big trees. I know a lot of you in Texas don't know what a big tree looks like, but in Indiana, we have huge, big maples and oaks and all that. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about? So they were playing and kicking the soccer ball around, and my mom says that there was not a cloud in the sky. It was not a stormy day. There was no expected rain. There was not a raindrop that fell in any place in the state of Indiana, but there was one cloud, apparently, that was coming over the house, and a random lightning bolt came from the cloud. It came down and it hit the tree that was in my front yard, this big maple tree that's still alive, traveled through the tree and under the ground, and it went up and electrocuted Huey, and he died. Yeah. So, not my brother, but Huey. Rushed to the hospital, 911, the whole thing. It was like, yeah, I'm sorry if that was a little abrupt, but I know about natural causes. As a non-Christian, that haunted me. And as a Christian now, I'm, still kind of getting my mind and heart around that one, just because of my own experience. The mystery of lightning bolts. Why this house and not that house? Tornadoes. Why this city and not that city? So we get into that. Now, some of that I may not be able to solve today, but I will stay closer to the why question, because I think we can't dislodge some of these things that happen from the process of testing that we're going to see. And this is always true in Job's situation. Now, we get to, we'll take our break right after this, because we get to the end of this cycle, verse 19, and we're expecting the curtains to fall on the scene. We're expecting Satan to say, yes, I got him. That's what we're expecting. But instead we see something radically different. Verse 20. Then Job arose, and he tore his robe, and he shaved his head, which in the ancient times would have been the steps to prepare and get involved in grieving. He's grieving loss, and this is what his preparation is to do. And then he falls to the ground and he worships. He worships. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I'll return. The Lord, capital Lord, Yahweh, gave, and Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God or ascribe something unseemly to God in that sense. So Job grieves and he worships. He accepts his situation. He accepts that his situation has come from the Lord. That's interesting. And because Job refuses to blame the Lord for his situation. So those are four significant things that we see here. I shared, maybe some of you are worship leaders in your church, and I actually shared this idea last night because I know I was going to be teaching it today. But this passage from Job, verse 20 especially, like if you are leading worship and you've got that traditional first service where all the gray hairs come, the older generation, they're all attending first service, and you've got them stoked up singing some of those old-time hymns, Amazing Grace, and, all of these things. They come to that service for a reason. I mean, that's the traditional. It's what they prefer, and all that loud drum music, they're not into that. We've got this first service at my church, and I shared as the president of the choir servant team last night. I gave a little devotional. I said, it's interesting. It struck me. A lot of those older people in our churches are going through grieving. They're at the stage in their life when they're losing friends every other week. Somebody's dying. And they've got struggles with health issues and health issues with some of their friends. And it's ongoing for them. They're struggling. But they're in having church. They come to church. And I said, it's our job as a choir at the hand of our worship pastor who's standing in front of the church leading worship, that we're helping them get to this point with Job. I don't know if you've ever thought of that before. Because when they come to church, they're grieving, but like Job, they're coming and they're worshiping too. And that's an amazing ministry that a choir and a church worship leader can have, whether you've got a worship team or a full-blown choir or whatever. They're coming to church and they're worshiping. And we need to remind ourselves and encourage our music ministers and our music, the people playing in the orchestra. They have a vital role in helping people through the grieving process, because that's part of it. And here we see it in Job's response. Worship is one of those interesting but proper responses for one who's going through grieving. As we're having a ministry to help people who are grieving, we need to encourage them to worship. So, let's take our first break. Let's come back in about 5 minutes and we'll pick up.